Where is Berryco? What you're about to hear will make you never look at barns the same way again. These aren't just old wooden structures dotting the countryside. They're tombs. They're torture chambers. They're places where screams echo through the night, and where the living become the dead in the most horrific ways imaginable. 6 true stories, 6 barns, 6 nightmares that actually happened. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll understand why some doors should never be opened. Let's begin. On March 15, 2019, dairy farmer Tom Mitchell hadn't heard from his neighbor Sarah Coleman in 3 days. Sarah lived alone on the adjacent property, and her daily routine was like clockwork. Every morning at 6 a.m., she'd milk her cows. Every evening at 5 p.m., she'd feed them. But for 3 straight days, Tom noticed her barn lights never came on. The cows were making an ungodly noise, a sound Tom had never heard in 30 years of farming. It wasn't the usual lowing. It was desperate, panicked, like they were trying to warn someone. Tom walked over to Sarah's property that Thursday afternoon. The farmhouse looked normal. Her car was in the driveway, but something felt wrong. The air itself seemed heavy, thick with a smell he couldn't quite place. He knocked on the front door. No answer. He called her name. Nothing. But those cows kept making that horrible noise, and now Tom could see why. They hadn't been milked in days. They were in agony. Tom had a spare key Sarah had given him for emergencies. This felt like one. He entered the house and called out again. Empty. Completely empty. But Sarah's purse was on the kitchen counter. Her phone was charging by the bed. Her shoes were by the door. She had to be in the barn. Tom walked across the yard, each step feeling heavier than the last. The barn door was slightly ajar, just enough for someone to slip through. He pushed it open and immediately gagged. The smell hit him like a physical blow. Death, decay, and something else. Something metallic. The cows were at the far end, desperate for attention. But Tom's eyes were fixed on the center of the barn floor. There, arranged in a perfect circle, were 6 wooden posts, driven deep into the ground. And tied to each post was a piece of clothing, Sarah's clothing, her jacket, her boots, her jeans, her shirt, her undergarments. And finally, tied to the 6th post was something that made Tom's blood freeze. A length of rope, stained dark red, with strands of blonde hair still attached. But Sarah was nowhere to be found. Tom called the police immediately. When they arrived, they made a discovery that haunts the investigators to this day. Buried 3 feet under the center of that circle was a metal box. Inside were dozens of photographs, all of Sarah, taken through her windows over the course of months. And at the bottom of the box was a journal. The entries detailed everything. How the killer had been watching Sarah for 8 months, how he'd learned her routine, how he'd been living in her barn loft, coming down only when she was asleep, how he'd been planning this moment for so long that he could taste it. The final entry, dated the morning Sarah disappeared, contained just 4 words. Tonight, she joins them. But here's what made everyone's skin crawl. The journal mentioned others, like Rebecca in Tennessee, like Maria in Oregon, like Jennifer in Texas. Different states, different barns, different women, but the same sick ritual. Sarah's body was never found. But 3 weeks later, another barn in a neighboring state was discovered with the same circular arrangement of posts, the same wooden stakes driven into the ground. the same dark stains in the center, and the cows making that same desperate warning sound that Tom still hears in his nightmares. Estate auctions are supposed to be about new beginnings. Someone dies, their belongings get sold, and life moves on. But when the Hendricks farm went up for auction in September 2021, nobody could have predicted the horror that was about to unfold. Old man Hendricks had lived alone for 40 years after his wife died, never had visitors, never spoke to neighbors. When he passed away at 89, distant relatives decided to sell everything and move on. The farm was beautiful. 200 acres of prime land, with a massive red barn that looked like something from a postcard. Marcus Chen, a young lawyer from the city, fell in love with it immediately. He'd always dreamed of country living, and when he won the auction, he felt like the luckiest man alive. The barn was going to be perfect for the woodworking shop he'd always wanted. Marcus moved in 2 weeks later. The first night, he heard scratching sounds coming from the barn. Probably mice, he thought. Old buildings always had mice, but the sounds were too rhythmic, too deliberate, like someone was carving something into wood. The next morning, Marcus went to investigate. The barn looked exactly as it had during the auction. Hay bales stacked neatly, old farming equipment covered in dust. Nothing out of place. But there, carved into the wooden beam near the entrance, were fresh scratch marks. They formed letters H-E-L-P. Marcus assumed it was old graffiti he'd missed before, kids being kids. He started setting up his workshop, but every night the scratching continued, and every morning there were new marks, new messages carved into the wood. Still here, cold, hungry. On the fourth night, Marcus decided to stay up and catch whoever was playing this sick prank. He hid behind a hay bale with a flashlight, waiting. Around 2 a.m., the scratching started again. But as Marcus listened, his blood turned to ice. The sounds weren't coming from inside the barn. They were coming from underneath it. Marcus grabbed a shovel and started digging where the sounds were strongest. 3 feet down, his shovel hit something hard, metal. He brushed away the dirt and found a steel grate covering what looked like a root cellar. But when he shined his flashlight through the grate, what he saw made him vomit instantly. Bones, human bones, scattered across the floor of an underground chamber. But these weren't old remains. Some still had flesh attached. Some still had clothing. And scratched into every surface of that underground prison were messages. Hundreds of them. Carved by fingernails, worn down to nothing. Help us. Been here years. Hendricks feeds us scraps. Please, someone find us. The police investigation revealed the truth. Hendricks hadn't been living alone. For decades, he'd been kidnapping people, drifters, runaways, people who wouldn't be missed. He'd keep them in that underground chamber, bringing them just enough food and water to keep them alive. And when they died, he'd bury them in the woods and find new victims. The final count was 18 bodies. 18 people who'd spent their final months or years scratching desperate messages into the walls of their underground tomb, hoping someone would hear them, hoping someone would save them. But here's the part that still gives investigators nightmares. When they examined the dates carved into the walls, they realized the last victim had only died 3 weeks before Marcus bought the property. 3 weeks. If he'd found that chamber just a month earlier, he could have saved someone. Marcus never spent another night on that property. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, neighbors still report hearing scratching sounds coming from the barn and fresh messages keep appearing on the wooden beams. Messages that simply say, "Thank you." Not all barns are used for livestock. Sometimes, they're used for something much worse. In the summer of 2020, social worker Jennifer Walsh received a tip about a family living on an isolated farm outside of Millerville. The caller claimed they'd seen children in the windows who looked malnourished and scared. Jennifer had investigated dozens of similar calls over her 15-year career. Most turned out to be misunderstandings. But something about this one felt different. The caller's voice shook when they described what they'd seen, and they'd called from a payphone, refusing to give their name. Jennifer drove out to the property on a Tuesday afternoon. The farmhouse looked normal from the outside. A little run down, but not unusual for rural areas. She knocked on the door and was greeted by a woman in her 40s who introduced herself as Mary. Mary was nervous. Her hands shook as she spoke, and she kept glancing toward the barn. When Jennifer asked about the children, Mary claimed they were at school, but it was July, summer vacation, and Jennifer noticed multiple pairs of small shoes by the door. "I'd like to see the children," Jennifer said firmly. Mary's face went white. They're napping. In the barn. It's cooler out there." Something about the way Mary said barn made Jennifer's skin crawl. It wasn't said like someone talking about a normal outbuilding. It was said like someone talking about a prison. Jennifer insisted on seeing the children immediately. Mary reluctantly led her across the yard to the large red barn. But as they got closer, Jennifer could hear sounds from inside. Not the sounds of sleeping children, whimpering, crying, and adult voices giving what sounded like commands. Mary fumbled with the barn door lock, her hands shaking so badly she could barely manage it. When the door finally swung open, Jennifer saw a sight that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The barn had been divided into small rooms using plywood and chicken wire. In each room was a child, some as young as 5, others in their teens. They were all thin, dirty, and terrified. But what made Jennifer's stomach turn was the older children, the teenage girls. They were all pregnant, and standing in the center of the barn was a man in his 60s who looked exactly like all the children. The same eyes, the same nose, the same facial structure. "Welcome to our family," he said with a smile that belonged in nightmares. The investigation that followed revealed one of the most disturbing criminal enterprises ever discovered in rural America. For 23 years, this man had been running what he called a breeding program. He'd fathered 37 children with various women, then used those children to produce more children. 3 generations of victims, all trapped in that barn, all living in conditions that barely qualified as human. The children had never seen a doctor, never been to school, never left the property. They didn't even know the outside world existed. Their entire universe was that barn, and their entire purpose was to produce more children for this monster's sick experiment. 12 of the children required immediate hospitalization. 7 of the teenage girls were pregnant with their own father's babies, and the youngest victims had never spoken to anyone except their captor and siblings. They didn't even know their real names. The man was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The barn was burned to the ground, but the children, those who survived, still struggle to adapt to the real world. Many have never recovered from the trauma of learning that the barn wasn't the entire universe, that there was a whole world out there they'd been denied. And sometimes, Jennifer still wakes up hearing those sounds. The whimpering, the crying, the sound of childhood innocence being destroyed in a barn that looked so normal from the outside. Some people collect stamps, others collect coins. Robert Steinberg collected something much more disturbing, and he kept his collection in a barn that neighbors thought was just used for storing old farm equipment. In October 2018, teenagers Jake and Emma decided to explore the abandoned farm on the edge of their small town. The property had been emptied for months after the owner, Robert Steinberg, died of a heart attack. Local kids had been daring each other to spend time there, and Jake wanted to impress Emma. They climbed through a broken fence and approached the large gray barn. The main doors were chained shut, but they found a loose board on the side that they could squeeze through. Inside, their flashlights revealed what looked like a normal barn. Hay bales, old tractors, nothing scary. But Emma noticed something odd about the far wall. It looked newer than the rest of the barn, and there was a door that didn't match the original construction. When they opened it, they found stairs leading down into a basement they couldn't have seen from outside. The basement was finished, clean, temperature controlled, and lining every wall were glass display cases, like something you'd see in a museum. But what was displayed in those cases made both teenagers scream. Hands, human hands, dozens of them, perfectly preserved and mounted like trophies. Each case had a small placard with information. Jennifer M., age 23. Waitress. Taken June 15th, 2015. Michael R., age 31. Mechanic. Taken September 3rd, 2016. But the hands weren't just randomly collected. They told a story. Each victim had something unique about their hands. A pianist with long, elegant fingers, a construction worker with calloused palms, an artist with paint permanently stained under her nails. Steinberg had been collecting hands based on what those hands could do. Jake and Emma ran from the barn and called police immediately. The investigation revealed that Robert Steinberg had been a serial killer for over 15 years. He traveled across multiple states, carefully selecting victims based on their professions and what made their hands special. But here's what made this case truly disturbing. Steinberg hadn't killed his victims quickly. Each hand in his collection showed evidence of being removed, while the victim was still alive. He'd kept them conscious so he could watch them realize what was happening, so he could see the moment they understood they'd never use their hands again. The police found journals detailing each victim, how he'd stalked them, how he'd learned about their talents, how he'd planned the perfect moment to take them, and most horrifying of all, how he'd kept them alive for days after removing their hands, watching them slowly die from infection and despair. 37 hands, 37 victims, 37 people who'd trusted the wrong stranger and ended up as trophies in a madman's collection. The barn was demolished 6 months later, but construction workers reported finding more basements, more rooms, and more display cases that had been hidden behind false walls. The final count of Steinberg's victims may never be known, and sometimes people driving past the empty lot where the barn used to stand report seeing lights moving underground. Lights that form the shapes of hands pressed against glass that's no longer there, belonging to victims who may still be trying to escape their eternal display. The Dalton family had run their pig farm for 4 generations. They were respected members of their community, known for their high-quality meat and their generous donations to local charities. But in March 2017, a routine environmental inspection revealed that their family business had a very dark secret. Inspector Maria Santos was checking water quality near the farm when she noticed something disturbing in the runoff from the pig barn. The water had an unusual chemical composition: too much phosphorus, too much nitrogen, levels that suggested the pigs were being fed something they shouldn't be eating. Maria decided to inspect the feeding operation. The Daltons were cooperative, showing her around their facilities with pride. The pigs looked healthy. The barn was clean. Everything appeared normal. But when Maria asked to see the feed storage area, she noticed the family exchange worried glances. The feed storage was in a separate building behind the main barn. As they approached, Maria detected a smell that didn't belong on a pig farm. It was sweet, cloying, like rotting flowers mixed with something metallic. Inside the storage building, Maria found bags of normal pig feed stacked neatly along the walls. But in the center of the room was a large industrial grinder, and next to it were several freezers. When she asked what the freezers were for, Old Man Dalton claimed they stored backup feed for winter. Something felt wrong. Maria insisted on checking the freezers. The first one contained normal feed. The second one contained normal feed. But the third freezer, when they opened it, Maria saw something that made her knees buckle. Body parts, human body parts, neatly packaged and labeled like cuts of meat at a butcher shop. Arms, legs, torsos, all prepared for feeding to the pigs. The investigation that followed revealed the most disturbing family business in American criminal history. For 30 years, the Dalton family had been disposing of murder victims by feeding them to their pigs. They weren't the killers themselves. They were contractors. Other criminals would pay them to make bodies disappear completely. Pigs will eat anything. Bones, teeth, hair, nothing remains. It's the perfect disposal method, and the Daltons had perfected it. They'd processed over 200 bodies through their operation, turning human beings into pig feed, then selling the pork to unsuspecting customers throughout the region. But here's the part that still gives investigators nightmares. When they tested the meat that had already been sold, they found human DNA in products that were sitting in grocery stores across 3 states. Thousands of families had unknowingly consumed human remains mixed with their pork. The entire Dalton family was arrested. 3 generations of accomplices to murder. The pig farm was shut down, and all the animals were destroyed. But the psychological damage to the community was irreversible. Nobody could eat pork anymore. Nobody could look at a pig without wondering if it had fed on human flesh. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right across the empty farm, neighbors report smelling that same sweet, cloying odor that Maria detected that day. The smell of death being prepared for consumption. The smell of a family business that turned cannibalism into commerce. The barn still stands, empty and rotting. But locals say if you listen carefully on quiet nights, you can hear the sound of the industrial grinder still running, processing victims that exist only in the memories of those who discovered the truth. Sometimes the most innocent activities become the deadliest. In June 2019, 12-year-old Katie Morrison was excited about her first sleepover at her new friend Melissa's house. The Hartwell family had recently moved to town, and their farm seemed like the perfect place for an adventure. Katie's parents dropped her off on Friday evening. The Hartwell house was beautiful, and Melissa's parents seemed normal. They had dinner together, played games, and when bedtime came, Melissa suggested they sleep in the barn instead of her bedroom. "It's like camping," Melissa said. "We do it all the time." The barn had been converted into a recreation area with comfortable furniture and sleeping bags already laid out. It seemed like fun. Katie called her parents to let them know about the change in plans, and they said it was fine as long as an adult was nearby. But around midnight, Katie woke up to find herself alone. Melissa was gone. The barn doors were locked from the outside, and she could hear voices coming from underneath the floor. Katie found a loose floorboard and pried it up. Below was a small basement room, and inside were 3 other children, all around her age, all claiming they'd come for sleepovers at the Hartwell farm and never left. "How long have you been here?" Katie whispered. The oldest child, a boy named David, said he'd been there for 8 months. The others had been there for varying lengths of time. They were fed once a day and allowed upstairs only when new children arrived to help make everything seem normal. Katie realized she was looking at a child trafficking operation. The Hartwells would kidnap children by luring them with fake friendships, then keep them hidden until buyers could be found. Melissa wasn't even their real daughter. She was just the longest-held victim, trained to help them catch new prey. Katie managed to find an old phone hidden in the basement and called 911. But when police arrived, they found an empty barn. No children, no evidence. The Hartwell family claimed Katie had run away during the night, and without proof, there was nothing police could do. But Katie's story never changed. And 6 months later, when another child went missing after a sleepover at a farm in a neighboring state, police realized they were dealing with a mobile operation. The Hartwells would move from town to town, establish themselves as a normal family, collect children, then disappear before anyone could investigate. The FBI finally caught them during their 4th relocation. When they raided the barn at the new property, they found 7 children locked in an underground chamber. Some had been missing for over 2 years. All had been trained to act as bait for new victims. The Hartwell case led to a massive investigation into organized child trafficking through rural properties. Dozens of farms were searched. Dozens of missing children were found, but many were never recovered, and the true scope of the operation may never be known. The barn where Katie spent that terrifying night was burned down, but she still has nightmares about the voices she heard underneath the floor. The voices of children calling for help from places no child should ever have to experience. And she knows that somewhere out there, other barns hide other children who are still waiting for someone to lift the floorboards and hear their cries. 6 barns, 6 nightmares, 6 true stories that prove the most innocent-looking places can hide the darkest secrets. These weren't random acts of violence. They were calculated, planned, executed by people who looked normal on the outside but harbored unspeakable evil within. The next time you drive past a barn in the countryside, remember these stories. Remember that behind those weathered wooden walls, someone might be fighting for their life. Someone might be carving desperate messages into the wood. Someone might be waiting for rescue that may never come. Because the truth is, evil doesn't always announce itself with scary music and dramatic lighting. Sometimes it hides behind friendly smiles and normal-looking buildings. Sometimes it wears the face of a neighbor, a farmer, or a family. And sometimes, the only thing standing between a victim and freedom is someone brave enough to look beyond the surface and ask the hard questions. These stories are real. These victims were real. Their suffering was real. And their memory demands that we never stop looking, never stop questioning, and never assume that just because something looks innocent on the outside, it actually is. Stay vigilant, stay suspicious, and never, ever ignore the warning signs. Because in a world where barns can become tombs, paranoia isn't madness, it's survival. If these stories made your skin crawl, like the video, it tells the algorithm you survived. Subscribe and turn on the bell. We drop new nightmares regularly. Share with someone brave or someone who thinks they are. Comment below. We want to know what you would have done. Some stories don't end when the lights come on. This is Dread Dynasty. We'll see you in the next scare.